Hi everybody, welcome. Today we're going to talk about how cameras capture light. What you see right here is a great diagram of an SLR, or a single lens reflex camera. Here is the inside there in a picture, so it's sort of more simplified. Light is going to travel through this camera in two different paths. It's going to travel to your eye in the viewer, which is up here. And it's also going to travel to the film or photo sensor, which is down here. Here's the light, and it is going to come here through the camera lens, which actually has several pieces of lens that all together create the focus. And what's actually happening is those separate lenses are actually either coming closer together or moving further apart in order to focus that light. Okay, so it's doing that, and then it's going to go through a little ring here that's kind of like the iris of your eye. It allows more or less light in. Okay, so it's either going to be a great big opening or a very small opening, and that's going to allow the light to pass in. And here's where the path diverges. Okay, so we go through the lenses, we go through the aperture. If we're headed to the viewport for the photographer to see it, it's going to hit this mirror, bounce up, and then bounce around in a piece of crystal called a pentaprism until it is facing the right way. And then it's going to go to the eyepiece. Remember when we did our pinhole cameras, how the image came straight through and hit your tray upside down? That's what this mirror and these condenser lenses and this pentaprism are all about. They're about flipping that image back the right way. It's got to flip up and it's got to flip around in order for the photographer to see it properly as it would be in reality. Okay, so that's the path of light to get up to the viewer for the eyepiece. The path of light to get to the photosensitive material or image sensor, it takes a similar path. Okay, we're going to go through our lenses as we did before. We're going to go through the aperture as it did before. But the mirror that you see slanted here is going to flip up and allow light to pass underneath it. And what's going to happen is it's going to go through a door that's back here. That door is called a shutter, and that shutter is going to open and then close really quick. When it opens, the light will go through, hit either the film or the photo sensor, and the image will be captured. If that shutter stayed open and didn't close again, the photo sensor would capture nothing but a great big white blob because too much light would be getting through. Okay, so you can kind of think of that shutter as like a door that cuts it off after enough light has come through to make a picture. Here are those parts that I was talking about. Here is the reflex mirror. It's the one that will bounce up. Here is that shutter. Almost looks like a garage door. And here is that pentaprism. This is what's actually inside the top here of this camera. And that's what's bouncing that light around to get to the eyepiece. To get to the photo sensor, here's that aperture. It's going to go through the aperture. It's going to go through the shutter, which will then be open. And it's going to hit the photo sensor or film, depending on what it is. Here it is in slow motion from the Slow-Mo guys. If you haven't checked out their YouTube channel yet, it's really cool. They have lots of slow motion things that we see every day, but slowed down incredibly.
Looking at the mirror, which is in front of the shutter, when I press down the button, the mirror flips up out of the way and temporarily blocks the viewfinder. Then the shutter comes down, whoosh, now light is exposing on the sensor, and then the shutter closes again, followed by the mirror coming back down, so you can see through the viewfinder again.
Isn't that neat? All of that happens in a fraction of a second. We don't see it. That's the click you hear. Cell phone cameras, though, are a little bit different. They don't have a shutter in the same way that a DSLR would, but they do still have several lenses. This one has five, no, six lenses. Can you imagine that something as thin as a little phone camera could have so many pieces of plastic in there that are focusing your image? And just like with a DSLR, those lenses are moving apart or closer together in order to capture the image sharply. There's a teeny motor in here that's doing that motion. And it's going through there and hitting the photo sensor. And then there's a ribbon that transmits that data into the brain of the phone, the central processing unit. You can see here the front and rear facing cameras of a cell phone. The front facing camera is going to be much, much smaller. The rear facing camera is going to be larger. And when you hear about megapixel, like how many megapixels your camera has, they're talking about this photo sensor. Look at how much larger the photo sensor is on the rear facing camera than it is on the front facing camera. That's because that rear facing camera, that has all the quality that that phone can take. You're not going to get a better picture than that one if you use that camera. Take a break now and try it yourself. Take a selfie using your front camera like you normally do for a selfie. And then flip your phone around and take a selfie using your rear facing camera. Once you've got those two pictures, I want you to zoom in on them and see which one has better quality and what qualities you see in the background, in the edges, or is it as crisp and clear as as the back facing one? I just want you to compare the two. Here's a close up of a photo sensor. You'll notice that there are three colors there for the three different color sensors that it has. These photo detectors can detect blue, green, and red. And with those three colors only, it can make up every other color we see because it depends on how much of each of those colors is activated. So what happens is as the light comes into the camera, the photons of light hit those sensors and excite them or not. If it's darkness in the picture, those sensors are not excited and so they stay black. If there's a strong color or bright color in there, it will excite those sensors. That's how the image is recorded. All of this data happens sort of very linearly. So it will record straight across the top, and then it will go to the next row of photo detectors and record that. And it will go to the next row after that, and after that, and after that, like lines of photo sensor that go down an image. How do cameras capture light? Cameras very carefully steer the light through different control mechanisms, increasingly focusing it onto the photosensitive material. Only when it's ready will the door open up and the photosensitive material be exposed to that light and capture that image. What controls the quality of the photos that we take? One of the qualities we look for is focus. And you'll notice that there's a vocab grab here. Anytime you see vocab grab in my notes, you know that it's going to be something that's tested material. You probably already know this term, focus, but I just want you to know that that pink tab means that this is an important piece of information. Exposure might be a new term to you. Exposure means the amount of light reaching the film or photo sensor. Exposure is controlled by the amount of light in the scene. So is it a night shot or is it a day shot? Are we indoors? Are we outdoors? How much light is in the scene? Also time. How long is that shutter going to stay open for the light to come through? Aperture. Remember that ring I told you about that's going to close up or open up? That's also going to control the exposure. Shutter speed, how fast that door is going to fly open and then slam shut. ISO, or the sensitivity of the film or light sensor. ISO is kind of like a measurement, like how inches measure distance and seconds measure time. ISO measures how sensitive the light, that photosensitive material is. And the last thing that controls exposure is software. Every time you get a software update, it may or may not include special information updating your camera and making it more able to take better low light settings or better action shots or whatever the particular update has. But software definitely plays a big role how the exposure is created. And depth of field refers to where is it clear. If the photographer is standing here and their subject is out there, there's a point at which it's going to be very clear, and there's a point at which it may go out of focus. And that's called the plane of focus. Okay. So say this is the photographer. The photographer's standing here. The subject is standing here. And here is just all of space. If that subject were to walk closer to the camera, he would get more blurry. If that subject were to back up and go further away from the camera, it would get more blurry. This area right here where it's nice and crisp and sharp and clear is called the plane of focus. That plane could be a short range, a short space. It might be just 2 feet either way in this area, or it might be very deep. It might be almost this entire field here. Okay, it and it depends on the aperture. Not to get too technical, but that aperture, when it's letting in more light, has a more shallow depth of field typically than if it's closed down tight and really focusing that light. Then it has a larger depth of field. Pinhole cameras, incidentally, have the deepest possible depth of field. It's just that they take a long time to capture all the visual data that's out there. We've all seen photos like this before. You probably think of it as portrait mode, where there's a person closer to the camera and everything behind them is really blurry, but they are perfectly crisp and clear. That's shallow depth of field. The plane that is able to be clear is very limited. It's only where in this picture this little girl is sitting. Way back here in the distance where the boy is, it's very blurry because that's out of the plane, that's beyond the plane of focus. This one over here where both the boy and the girl are crystal clear, that is deep depth of field. Here's a great example of deep depth of field. See the rocks down here close to the camera? Crystal clear. The shoreline way back there, and you know that must be hundreds and hundreds of feet away, is crystal clear. Those mountains, which are even further away, are also crystal clear. This is a deep depth of field. Deep or shallow. We got blur here. We got clarity a little bit further back. And way in the background, we got the blurriest of backgrounds. Shallow or deep. If you guessed shallow, you're right. Shallow or deep. We've got these crystal clear flowers right here and blur in the background. If you guessed shallow, you're right. And it can be the reverse too. You can have the background be crystal clear and the foreground be all blurry, and that too would be shallow depth of field. Deep is when everything is clear. Is this a good photo? I look at this and I see that back here in the background, those flowers are super blurry. This flower is a little bit blurry, but it's more clear than these back here. I would say this is not a very good photo because the difference between the blurry part in the background and the clear part in the foreground is not great enough. The clear part is not clear enough. Okay, so when you're taking a photo that has that depth of field quality to it, you want to have some part of it be nice and crystal clear. And then there's this type of photo. This is what you call bokeh, and there's a whole school of photographers who love to shoot like this. You know, they're looking for water droplets illuminated from behind by colorful lights, and they're all blurry. There's nothing clear about this image. I love to show this image because I love for you to know that just as soon as you come up with a rule in art, like there's something in the picture has to be clear, it can't all be blurry, there's some sort of use for the all blurry picture because rules are important, but they're also important to be broken. All right, now many of you have portrait mode on your camera, and so creating that background blur and foreground clarity is very easy. Some of you do not have that, but you can still do it. Okay, there's a trick to it. When you take your camera and you want to take a picture, like say it's going to take a picture of me, what you want to do is tap on it. And you should see a tiny sun in there. I don't know if you could see it. Take your picture and tap on it. You see that little sun? Wherever you see that box and that sun, that's where the camera is going to focus. So if you have something very close to that camera and something further away from that camera, tap on the part you want it to focus on. The other part will be blurry. By tapping, you are defining the plane of focus. The cool thing about that trick is that we will take that with us over to video, because shifting the view in a video from one side of the screen being clear to the other side of the screen being clear is called a racked focus. And that racked focus is something that movie makers do all the time when they want to shift our attention as the audience from one character over to another. Okay, so learning how to control focus by tapping is super important. Okay, you'll be going to using that later. Here's a terrific video talking more about portrait mode.
Portrait mode. That's probably a phrase you've heard a lot more about lately. Portrait mode this, live focus that, depth effect over here, shallow depth of field over there. So here I have iPhone 10, Galaxy Note 8, and Google Pixel 2, all of which have really, really high-end cameras, and of course, they all have a portrait mode to try to emulate what this guy does. So let's see how they stack up. All right, so here's what I would consider your standard portrait mode example. Same photo, same angle from iPhone 10, Galaxy Note 8, Pixel 2, and the Hasselblad. And you can see some differences right off the bat, and then when I put them all side by side, especially, of course, how the Hasselblad does it so well. Now, what you're going to start to notice is that portrait mode on these smartphone cameras, it does a pretty good job of replicating the general effect of a shallow depth of field.
Do you also notice that the coloring changes in the different cameras? Look at how the teal of his hoodie looks so much brighter on the Note 8 than it does on the iPhone X. It looks like this is somebody wearing 4 different hoodies because the hoodie colors have changed. The skin tone also, where it's catching the highlight, is changing throughout. So the type of camera that you use and the software that operates it in order to capture an exposure really, really can affect the image quality. Also, look at how blurry the background is in each of these. This Pixel 2, it almost looks fake how blurry that background is compared to how sharp he is. The Note 8, there's not a whole lot of difference, and on down the line. I'm not going to play this whole video. I just want you to play it on your own and see the difference between these different cameras. It's really interesting. They all basically have the same parts, but software is making them use those parts slightly differently. Ask you now, what do you think influences photography more these days? Software or hardware? Where is the innovation happening? There's no right answer to this question, but it's really something worth considering. Where are we spending our energy improving and advancing this art that we call photography? Okay, now we're going to talk about different modes that your camera might have. Very basic ones that all of us should have are autofocus, AE/AF lock, and burst. Autofocus simply means you just point and shoot. You don't tap on anything, you don't do any special changes to your camera. You're just pointing and shooting, and that's it. Tap to focus is what we did already, tapping, finding that little box, and then choosing what's going to be in focus that way. Tap to focus to me is one of the best features about a phone that puts the power to make photographic decisions in your hands. Lock focus, where you see AEAF lock right on there, that's auto exposure, auto focus. So if you're locking those two things, wherever you take your camera and move it around, it's going to use the same focus and exposure level as how you locked it. I don't use this too much. It can sometimes be handy in low light settings. Burst is a really fun thing to use, especially if you're trying to take action photos of somebody doing some sort of movement that's fast. You, number one, though, need a lot of light. So these are photos that you want to take outside. Number two, you need somebody doing something in front of you. If you just have them kind of sitting still, it's not really a great use of burst. And number three, since the updates, the iPhone, I think 10 and 11 both have a slightly different interface than just tap and hold the shutter release, and that's what the rest of us are doing. When I'm taking a burst, I am tapping and holding that shutter release for as long as I want that burst to be. It's not video, it is a whole series of photos all done at once. If you are on a iPhone 10 or 11, you're going to tap and slide. So you'll hit that photo release but slide to the left, kind of in one fluid motion. If it doesn't do a burst and it goes into video, you did it wrong. It's going to take a little bit to get used to how that works because it's a very fussy touch thing. Okay, once you've got your burst, if you tap on it and go into photos, you should see something that says select. And you just tap on select. And then it will let you flip through all the different pictures that you took. I just took some random pictures of my desk, which is sloppy, but if you took an actual good picture of somebody jumping or doing a skateboard trick or dancing or something interesting, you will have really great burst photos. To choose the ones you want to keep, and you can keep all of them or one of them or however many you want, you just press the little, there's like a tiny, can you see that? There's a tiny circle, and if you click it, you can put a check mark, and then you will click up at the top, choose selected, and it will save all of those that you clicked, and it will delete all the rest of them. Exposure is something that you can control. I know that it has to do with the light around you and all that, but there is some level of control that you have with a cell phone camera. Exposure, we already talked about, means the amount of light that's hitting your camera's image sensor. It affects the focus, it affects the color perceived in the image, and it affects the depth of field. So for instance, here is one image with different exposure settings. And you'll notice that in some of them, the colors are very vivid, and in other ones, those colors are kind of muted and kind of blah. And in the third one, the colors are really washed out. They're bright, but they're almost like pastel. That means that it's been overexposed. There's a little bit too much light here. And this one, where it's really dull, means that it's underexposed or not enough light. Here's another example. And and this introduces something that I think is important to photography, is that the photographer always needs to ask themselves, why am I taking this picture? What's important about this picture? And if you ask yourself that question, you will always take good pictures, because you can hone in on how dark does it need to be? How light does it need to be? How close do I need to get? How far away should I stand? All kinds of questions like this. Figure out why you're taking that picture. What's important there? So to me, this picture is all about this really cool dog trying to bite at these bubbles. In this one that's underexposed, we can, I mean, the dog almost looks like a ghost. He's so bright, we can hardly see him. But we do have lots of color in these bubbles. We do see all the different shades of green that there are in the yard and in the trees in the background. We can see some detail. We can see individual plants. We can see the pots. But is this photo about the backyard, or is it about the dog in the bubbles? You know, that will tell you that this is not a good exposure, because it's not highlighting the important thing, and that's the dog. This is the one in the middle. This is what you would call underexposed. Yes, we have lots of detail about the dog. We can see the shadows of his muscles, and we can see, more of that facial expression. But we've almost lost these bubbles. It's just like barely outlined. And that's an important thing, that whimsy of those bubbles. You got to be able to see that. This photo over here is perfectly exposed, because we can see the rainbow of the bubbles. We can see that they're bubbles, not just outlines. We can still see some of that musculature of the dog. We can see his spots still. We can see some of the background. We can see the color of the different shades of green. We can see some detail, but it's not a lot of detail back there. The focus of this image is still on that dog. And that's how we know that's the right exposure. We talked about this. Exposure changes how we perceive color, and you can see how this color changes as you go the different exposure settings. Is this photo properly exposed, overexposed, or underexposed? If you saw this slide in class, the whole class will probably answer in different ways. Some people say this is perfect, because this is about laying in a hammock and looking at the sunset. And with it, the person being so dark, it's more easy to imagine yourself there. Other people say this is too dark, because we can't see the person in the hammock very well. It's up to the photographer. It's not math. There's not a delineated right answer. Again, you got to rely on the question, why am I taking this picture? Am I taking it because it's a nice, peaceful evening at the shore? Or am I taking it because I want to show that person in their hammock? Or do I want to show both? That's how you make decisions about this. And I always tell people, now that we're digital, photos are cheap. Take multiple exposures and look at them and see which one is the best one. Over, under, or perfect. We got a nice landscape here. This is the California coast. Up to you, the photographer. Is it over? Is it under? I would say it's a little overexposed, because I want to see a little bit more darkness of those mountains there in the background. But somebody might argue with me. Somebody might say these softer tones are very relaxing. It feels almost like the whole image is kind of bleached by the ocean. It's perfect the way it is. Personal preference. All right, here is that sun I was telling you about, and I was trying to show you. If you tap to focus, you're going to see a tiny sun. That tiny sun, if you drag it up, will increase the exposure and allow more light in. If you drag it down, it will decrease the exposure and it will have less light. So your image will go brighter or darker as you move that slider. This is such a huge game changer, especially if you're trying to take indoor pictures under like kind of questionable lighting conditions. This will up your game.